Hello there, and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable wherever you are. Let your body sink into whatever supports you now. Where in the world are you watching from? A quiet bedroom where the day has finally released you. A cozy corner where you can let everything else fall away. Wherever you are, you're welcome here. Tonight we're going to explore one of history's most beautiful mysteries, the Amber Room, a chamber so magnificent it was called the eighth wonder of the world. We'll discover how it was created, piece by luminous piece, in the early 1700s. We'll walk through its golden walls during the height of Imperial Russia, when empires believed they would last forever. And we'll follow its trail through war and loss, through decades of searching, and into the quiet acceptance that some things, once gone, leave only their stories behind. But don't worry, this isn't going to be a frantic treasure hunt or a tale designed to disturb your rest. Instead, we'll move slowly and carefully through 2.5 centuries of history, taking our time with each detail, each moment of beauty, each quiet mystery. By the end, I think you'll find something peaceful in contemplating this lost masterpiece, how it was loved, how it was lost, and what it teaches us about holding beauty lightly. If you enjoy these calm explorations through history's quieter corners, a like and subscribe really helps reach others seeking the same peaceful way to end their day. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being here, for returning to these long, slow journeys through time, so settle in now. Let your shoulders drop, take a slow breath, and then another. Let's begin our slow drift through the story of the Amber Room. There's nowhere you need to be right now, nothing you need to do. Just listen and let the story unfold like amber itself. Warm, golden, and impossibly old. Before we can understand the room, we need to understand amber itself, this substance that seems caught between stone and light, between the living and the eternal. Amber is fossilized tree resin, formed over millions of years. When certain trees, mostly conifers, mostly pines, were damaged, they wept sticky resin to seal their wounds. That resin, golden and thick, would sometimes drip to the forest floor, sometimes trap insects in its descent, always hardening slowly in the ancient air. And then, over unimaginable stretches of time, buried under sediment, compressed by the weight of millennia, it transformed. The organic compounds rearranged themselves. The resin became something harder, something that could last forever, something that held light the way memory holds moments. The Baltic region, particularly the coastline of what is now Kaliningrad, Russia, and the shores of Poland and Lithuania, is where the finest amber has been found for thousands of years. After storms, the sea would cast up pieces of this fossilized sunlight. Ancient peoples would walk the beaches, gathering these warm fragments, these pieces of captured light. They didn't know about geological time, about 40 million years passing in the slow transformation of resin to stone. But they knew beauty when they saw it. And what beauty it was, this amber. Hold a piece to the light, and it glows from within. Honey-coloured, sometimes nearly clear. Sometimes clouded with ancient bubbles of air, sometimes containing the perfect shadow of a fly that died before humans learned to speak. The Greeks called it electron, because when you rubbed it, it created static electricity, a kind of magic they couldn't explain. The Romans prized it so highly, they sent expeditions to the Baltic, travelling thousands of miles for this golden substance. They carved it into jewellery, into ornaments, into objects both sacred and decorative. But no one, in all the centuries humans had treasured amber, had ever dreamed of a room made entirely from it. No one had imagined walls that would glow like captured sunlight, panels that would warm a space not with heat but with their very presence. The amount of amber needed would be staggering. Thousands of pounds, carefully selected, painstakingly carved and fitted. And the skill required would be extraordinary, because amber is brittle, unpredictable, each piece unique in its colour and clarity. The idea when it finally came, was born in a time when princes competed to create wonders, when craftsmanship reached heights we can barely imagine today. It was born in Prussia, in the early years of the 18th century, in the mind of a king who wanted to create something the world had never seen. And this brings us naturally to the man who first dreamed this impossible dream, the king who would commission something so beautiful it would outlive his name in fame, if not in substance. Frederick I of Prussia was a man of considerable ambition, which is perhaps the kindest way to say it. He had spent years manoeuvring to elevate his status from Elector of Brandenburg to king in Prussia, a distinction that mattered enormously in the complex hierarchies of early 18th century Europe, and kings, in that era, proved their status through magnificence. The idea for an amber room likely began around 1700 or 1701 in the Palace of Charlottenburg, where Frederick was transforming a modest summer residence into something grander. He had already commissioned the finest craftsmen for his various projects, gilders and carvers, painters and architects. But amber would be something unprecedented. A room panelled in amber would announce to the world that Prussia had arrived, that Frederick was not merely a king in title, but a patron of arts magnificent enough to rival France, wealthy enough to commission the impossible. He turned to the finest amber craftsman he could find, Andreas Schluter, an architect and sculptor already famous for his work on the Berlin Palace. Schluter understood the challenges immediately. Amber couldn't simply be cut like wood or polished like marble. Each piece had its own character, its own inclusions and flaws and shades of honey and gold. The panels would need to be created as intricate mosaics, thousands of smaller pieces fitted together, backed with gold leaf to enhance their glow, set in frames that would protect their fragile beauty. Working alongside Schluter was Gottfried Wolfram, a Danish amber master whose expertise was essential to the project's success. Together they began the painstaking work of creating amber panels for a room in Frederick's palace. They selected the finest Baltic amber, pieces as clear as possible, with the warmest, most luminous tones. They cut and shaped and fitted, creating Baroque designs of extraordinary complexity, scrollwork and flowers, shells and ribbons, all rendered in glowing amber backed with gold. The work progressed slowly, as such work must. You cannot rush amber, you cannot force it to be what it isn't. Each piece had to be studied, understood, incorporated into the larger design with patience and precision. The craftsmen worked for years, creating panels that seemed to capture light itself, that made the room glow as if lit from within even on the greyest days. But Frederick would not live to see his amber room completed. He died in 1713, having ruled as king for only 12 years. His son, Frederick William I, cared little for such extravagances. He was a soldier king, practical and austere, unmoved by rooms that glowed like captured sunlight. The amber panels, still not fully installed, remained in storage, a half-finished dream waiting for someone who would understand their beauty. That someone would come from the east, from Russia, where an empress was building a new capital and filling it with wonders. And through a diplomatic gift born of political necessity, Frederick's amber panels would find their way to a palace on the edge of Europe, where they would become something even more magnificent than their creator had imagined. The panels were about to begin a journey that would take them far from Prussia, into the heart of Imperial Russia, where they would finally become the room they were always meant to be. In 1716, diplomacy took a form that seems almost impossibly generous by modern standards. Peter the Great of Russia visited Prussia, and Frederick William I, despite his lack of interest in artistic extravagance, understood the value of cementing an alliance with the powerful Russian Empire. He needed Peter's support, or at least his neutrality, in the complex politics of Northern Europe, and so he gave Peter the amber panels. Not as a loan, not as part of a trade, but as a gift, a royal gift from one monarch to another, the kind of gesture that created obligations and alliances more binding than any written treaty. Peter accepted with pleasure. He understood beauty, even if Frederick William did not. He understood that these amber panels represented something rare and precious, a work of craftsmanship that elevated whoever possessed it. The panels were carefully packed and transported to Russia, a journey of hundreds of miles through territories that were often hostile, along roads that were barely passable. Each crate had to be handled with extraordinary care. Amber is not as fragile as glass, but it can crack, can shatter if dropped or struck. The loss of even a single panel would have been catastrophic. But the panels arrived intact, and Peter installed them in the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, his new capital built on marshland, his window to the west. There, in the Winter Palace, the amber panels were first assembled into something resembling a room, though not yet the room they would become. The space glowed with that characteristic amber light, warm and golden, utterly unlike anything else in the palace. Visitors were astonished. They had seen rooms panelled in rare woods, walls covered in silk or painted with frescoes, but nothing like this. The amber seemed alive, seemed to breathe light. But Peter died in 1725, and the amber panels passed through several hands, through several rooms, never quite finding their permanent home. They were too precious to be forgotten, too magnificent to be relegated to storage, but also too specific, too unusual to fit easily into the evolving aesthetic of the Russian court. It would take another ruler, another visionary to see their full potential. It would take a woman who understood power and beauty in equal measure, who would transform these Prussian panels into something unmistakably Russian, something that would become known throughout Europe as one of the wonders of the world. Catherine the Great, when she came to power in 1762, inherited many things: an empire, a court, and these strange glowing amber panels that had languished for decades without a proper setting. She would give them that setting, and in doing so would create something that has haunted imaginations ever since, a room that became legend even before it was lost. Catherine the Great was not Russian by birth. Born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst in 1729, a minor German princess, she came to Russia at 14 to marry the heir to the throne. She learned Russian, converted to Orthodoxy, took the name Catherine, and waited. When her husband became Tsar Peter III in 1762, his reign lasted only months before Catherine, with the support of the military and the court, replaced him. She would rule Russia for 34 years, transforming it into a major European power. And she understood, as all great rulers must, the power of symbols. The Amber Room, which had existed in pieces and partial installations since Peter the Great first brought it to Russia, would become her masterpiece, her statement to the world of Russia's sophistication and wealth. She moved the amber panels to the Catherine Palace in Tsarskoye Selo, the royal residence about 15 miles south of St. Petersburg. There, in a room specifically designed to showcase them, she had the panels installed with additions that would complete the vision. The original Prussian panels covered only about 180 square feet. Catherine's room was much larger, and she commissioned Russian craftsmen to create additional amber panels in the same style to fill the space completely. The work took craftsmen years to complete. They had to match the Baroque style of the original panels, had to find amber of comparable quality and colour, had to achieve the same level of craftsmanship that Schluter and Wolfram had brought to the original work. They succeeded brilliantly. Additional amber panels were created along with amber frames for mirrors and paintings, amber pilasters and decorative elements that tied the room together into a coherent whole. When complete, the amber room measured about 55 square metres, roughly 600 square feet, and contained about 6 tons of amber. The walls were covered in amber panels from floor to ceiling, each panel backed with gold leaf that made the amber glow even more brilliantly. Between the amber panels were mirrors, strategically placed to multiply the light, to create the illusion that the room extended forever in golden reflection. The ceiling was painted with allegorical scenes. The floor was laid with intricate parquet, but it was the amber that dominated, that transformed the space into something otherworldly. By day, natural light from the windows would set the entire room glowing, the amber ranging from deep honey to pale gold, from nearly transparent to richly opaque. By night, candlelight would make the walls seem to flicker and breathe, as if the room itself were alive. Visitors described feeling as though they had stepped inside a jewel, inside captured sunlight, inside a dream of what wealth and power and beauty could create when brought together without restraint. Catherine filled the room with additional treasures, amber-framed paintings, decorative objects, furniture worthy of the setting. She used it to receive important guests, to demonstrate Russian sophistication, to create an experience that would be remembered and recounted across Europe. The Amber Room became famous, a destination for anyone visiting the Russian court, a wonder that exceeded description. And there it remained for nearly 2 centuries, through the reigns of Catherine's successors, through the rise and fall of the Romanov dynasty, through revolutions and wars, surviving remarkably intact until the 20th century brought new and terrible dangers that even such beauty could not escape. For nearly 200 years, the Amber Room existed in a kind of charmed stability. The Catherine Palace became a summer residence for Russian tsars, a place of relative peace and luxury outside the political turbulence of St. Petersburg. The room was maintained, carefully preserved, occasionally photographed as that technology developed. During this time, it accumulated stories. Catherine herself reportedly spent hours in the room, using it for intimate gatherings, for diplomatic meetings where the magnificence of the setting lent weight to Russia's position. Her successors continued this tradition, though perhaps without quite the same appreciation for the room's aesthetic achievement. To them, it was simply one wonder among many in palaces filled with treasures. Visitors left accounts that help us understand what the room meant to those who saw it. They wrote of being overwhelmed by the golden glow, of how the amber seemed warm to the touch even in winter, of how the mirrors multiplied the light until the room seemed infinite. Some described a scent, whether real or imagined, of ancient forests of resin and thyme. Others noted how the room changed with the light, how it looked different in morning sun versus afternoon shadow versus candlelight, each time revealing new depths in the amber, new shades of gold. The room required constant maintenance. Amber, though hard, can crack in extreme temperature changes. It can darken with age, can become brittle. Craftsmen were employed specifically to care for it, to repair any damage, to ensure that the panels remained secure in their frames. These were skilled positions, passed down through families sometimes. Knowledge of how to work with amber preserved through generations of careful practice. Photographs from the early 1900s show a room that was still magnificent but showing its age. Some panels had darkened slightly. The gold leaf backing had tarnished in places. There were minor cracks, small losses, but the overall effect remained overwhelming, a room that glowed with captured light, that represented an age when craftsmanship could achieve what seemed impossible. And then came the 20th century with its wars and revolutions. The Romanov dynasty fell in 1917. The Catherine Palace became a museum, the Amber Room a treasured artifact of a vanished age. Soviet authorities recognized its value, though perhaps not its vulnerability. It survived the Russian Civil War, survived Stalin's purges, survived the turmoil of the 1930s. But it could not survive what was coming next. In 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in the largest military operation in history, and the Amber Room found itself in the path of advancing armies. Its 2-century reign of peaceful beauty was about to end, and with that ending would begin a mystery that persists to this day, a loss that still aches more than 80 years later. Let's move forward now, carefully into the darkness of wartime, and witness how quickly beauty can disappear when the world descends into chaos. Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, when German forces crossed the Soviet border along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. 3 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, thousands of aircraft, the largest invasion force ever assembled. The objective was nothing less than the destruction of the Soviet Union, the capture of its resources, the subjugation of its people. Leningrad, as St. Petersburg was then called, stood directly in the path of Army Group North. And just outside Leningrad, in the summer palace grounds at Tsarskoye Selo, the Amber Room waited in its gallery, glowing in the June sunlight. Utterly unaware that the world it had known for 2 centuries was about to end, Soviet authorities understood the danger, but perhaps not quickly enough, not completely enough. The German advance was faster than anticipated, more overwhelming than anyone had prepared for. Within weeks, Nazi forces were approaching the outskirts of Leningrad. Museum curators across the region scrambled to evacuate treasures. Paintings were cut from frames, sculptures were crated. Entire collections were loaded onto trains heading east into the Soviet interior. The Amber Room presented a unique and terrible problem. How do you move 6 tons of amber, fitted precisely into wall panels, backed with gold leaf, held together by 18th century construction techniques that were never designed for disassembly? The curators faced an impossible choice: attempt to remove the panels and risk destroying them in the process, or leave them in place and hope somehow they could be protected. They tried. In those frantic weeks as German forces drew closer, workers attempted to carefully remove some of the amber panels. But the amber had become brittle with age. The backing had fused to the walls in places. When they tried to separate the panels, pieces began to crack, began to crumble. The attempt was causing more damage than it was preventing. They stopped, made a different decision. Perhaps the only decision they could make given the time and resources available. They covered the walls. They hung wallpaper over the amber panels, hoping somehow this would disguise their value, would make the room look ordinary, unremarkable, not worth particular attention from whatever occupation forces might arrive. It was a desperate measure, a kind of wishful thinking born of having no good options. The wallpaper covered the glow, but could not hide what the room truly was. By September, German forces had surrounded Leningrad, beginning a siege that would last 900 days and cost more than 1 million lives. The Catherine Palace fell under German control. Officers moved through the rooms, cataloguing treasures, identifying what was valuable, what was portable, what could be sent back to Germany. And they found the Amber Room. The wallpaper fooled no one. Perhaps someone informed them. There were always informers in occupied territories. People desperate or opportunistic or simply trying to survive. Perhaps they already knew from intelligence reports what treasures the Catherine Palace contained. However they learned of it, they knew exactly what they had found. The decision was made at the highest levels. The Amber Room would be dismantled and shipped to Germany. It would be done carefully by experts who understood its value, who could remove the panels without destroying them. The room that had been too fragile for Soviet curators to move would be taken apart by German specialists and transported hundreds of miles to the west. This is where the Amber Room's journey into mystery truly begins, where its story becomes tangled with war and occupation and competing accounts of what happened next. We know it was removed from the Catherine Palace. We know it was packed and shipped. But from there, the details become murky, the accounts contradictory, the evidence incomplete. Let's follow its path as best we can, tracing the Amber Room's movement through the chaos of war, watching as it travels west into Germany, into a city that would itself be destroyed before the war ended. The Germans who dismantled the Amber Room were not soldiers. They were specialists, art historians, museum professionals, craftsmen who understood the technical challenges of moving something so precious and so fragile. This wasn't random looting by troops in the field. This was organised, sanctioned theft at the highest levels of the Nazi regime. The operation was overseen by the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, Alfred Rosenberg's task force for cultural plunder. Rosenberg, one of the chief architects of Nazi ideology, had created an organisation dedicated to systematically looting cultural treasures from occupied territories. Art, books, religious objects, historical artifacts, anything of value was catalogued, confiscated, shipped to Germany for redistribution to museums, to private collections, to Hitler's planned Führer Museum in Linz. The Amber Room represented a particularly significant prize. Its origin in Prussia made it, in Nazi ideology, German property that had been given away and should now be reclaimed. This justification, however flimsy, provided the legal framework for what was straightforward theft. The room would be _0_ to Germany, specifically to Königsberg, capital of East Prussia, the region where much of the amber had originally been harvested centuries before. The dismantling took approximately 36 hours in late September or early October of 1941. German specialists carefully removed the amber panels from their wooden backing, catalogued each piece, wrapped them in paper and fabric, packed them in crates specially constructed for the purpose. They worked methodically, treating the amber with more respect than they showed the people whose country they were occupying, whose city they were besieging, whose possessions they were stealing. Contemporary accounts suggest the work was done with genuine expertise. The panels came away from the walls relatively intact, though some damage was inevitable. Small pieces broke off. Fragments were lost in the process. But the major panels survived removal, a testament both to 18th century construction and to 20th century careful hands, however criminal their purpose. The crates were loaded onto trucks, then onto trains. The convoy moved west through occupied territory, through Poland, heading for Königsberg on the Baltic coast. The journey took several days, moving through a landscape being transformed by war, through towns and villages that would themselves be destroyed in the years to come. The Amber Room travelled in darkness, hidden in crates, unknowing that it was leaving Russia forever. In Königsberg, preparations had been made to receive it. Königsberg Castle, a medieval fortress that had been transformed over centuries into a grand palace complex, would be its new home. Specifically, the room was destined for the Castle Museum, where it would be reassembled and displayed as evidence of German cultural superiority, as proof that the Reich was not only militarily powerful, but also the rightful inheritor and protector of European cultural treasures. The reassembly began in late 1941 or early 1942. German craftsmen, working from photographs and from the knowledge of the specialists who had dismantled it, began fitting the amber panels into new wall frames in a room in the castle. It was painstaking work, complicated by the fact that the room in Königsberg was not identical to the room in the Catherine Palace. Panels had to be adapted, some pieces rearranged, the overall design modified to fit the new space. But they succeeded. By early 1942, the Amber Room existed again, glowing in its new home, visited by Nazi officials who admired it without irony or shame, who saw in its beauty confirmation of their racial theories about German cultural achievement. The room that Catherine had completed, that had shone in peaceful magnificence for 2 centuries, now existed in a city that would soon be on the front lines of a war Germany was beginning to lose, and this is where our certain knowledge ends and speculation begins, where the story fractures into multiple possible endings, none of them completely confirmed, all of them ending in the same result. The Amber Room's disappearance into history, into mystery, into a silence that has lasted more than 80 years. Königsberg in 1942 was still relatively untouched by the war that was consuming the rest of Europe. The city went about its business, ancient capital of East Prussia, home to universities and museums, a port on the Baltic, birthplace of the philosopher Immanuel Kant. The war felt distant. Victories were still being announced. The Reich seemed invincible. The Amber Room, newly installed in the Castle Museum, became something of a tourist attraction for Nazi officials and favoured visitors. They came to see this reclaimed treasure, this proof of German cultural genius. Photographs from this period show the room reassembled, though not perfectly. Some panels are clearly missing. Some sections show gaps where amber should have been but wasn't. Damage from the dismantling and transport that couldn't be completely repaired. But enough of the room existed to create that characteristic glow, that sense of being inside captured light. The curator of the Castle Museum, Alfred Rode, oversaw the Amber Room's care. Rode was a complicated figure, an art historian who appreciated the room's beauty but served a regime that had stolen it, who maintained professional standards while participating in cultural theft. He kept careful records of the room's condition, documented the gaps and damage, made plans for future conservation work that would never happen. But by 1943, the war's trajectory had shifted. Stalingrad had fallen to Soviet forces in February. The tide was turning. Germany was no longer advancing but defending, and the Eastern Front was moving inexorably westward. Königsberg, which had seemed safely distant from the fighting, began to understand that it might one day be in danger. Museum officials across Germany began making plans to evacuate treasures to safer locations. Paintings were sent to salt mines, sculptures to castles in remote regions, rare books to monasteries. The question of what to do with the Amber Room arose repeatedly. It was too valuable to leave in place if the city was threatened, but also extraordinarily difficult to move. The panels had been damaged by one dismantling and transport. Could they survive another? By 1944, the situation was critical. Soviet forces were advancing through Poland. The Baltic states had been retaken. Königsberg was clearly in the path of the Red Army's westward drive. The city began preparing for siege, for bombardment, for the possibility of street fighting. Museum collections were evacuated in chaotic haste, crates loaded onto trains, onto ships, sent west to cities that were themselves under threat from Allied bombing. What happened to the Amber Room during this period remains one of history's persistent mysteries. We have fragmentary accounts, contradictory testimonies, documents that raise more questions than they answer. Alfred Rode, the curator, reportedly packed some of the amber panels into crates in August of 1944. But did he pack all of them? Were they shipped? If so, where? Or were they hidden somewhere in Königsberg itself, waiting for the war to end, for the situation to stabilize, for a time when they could be safely moved? The last confirmed sighting of the Amber Room was in August of 1944, still in the castle, though possibly in the process of being dismantled again. After that, the accounts diverge. Some witnesses later claimed the panels were shipped west. Others said they were hidden in castle cellars. Still others suggested they remained on display until the very end, until the final catastrophe that would destroy the castle and much of the city with it. What we know for certain is that by the end of 1944, Königsberg was being bombed regularly by Soviet aircraft. The city was filling with refugees fleeing the approaching Red Army, and whatever plans existed for the Amber Room's safety were being overtaken by the chaos of Germany's collapse. The siege of Königsberg began in January of 1945, when Soviet forces encircled the city, cutting it off from the rest of Germany. Inside the encirclement were approximately 130,000 German soldiers, and perhaps double that many civilians, people who had nowhere left to run, who had waited too long to evacuate, who refused to believe the Red Army would actually reach them. The bombardment started almost immediately. Soviet artillery pounded the city day and night. Aircraft bombed military installations, transportation hubs, and increasingly the city centre itself. Königsberg, which had stood for 700 years, which had survived medieval wars and Napoleonic occupation, began to burn. The castle, sitting prominently on a hill overlooking the river, was an obvious military target. German forces were using it as a command post, as a storage facility, as a defensive position. This made it a priority for Soviet gunners. Shells struck the ancient walls repeatedly. Fires broke out, were extinguished, broke out again. During the first weeks of the siege, there might still have been time to save the Amber Room if anyone knew where it was, if moving it was still possible, if it was still intact. But the city was in chaos. Food was running short. Medical supplies were exhausted. The civilian population was trapped between two armies, and the fate of an Amber Room however magnificent, was not a priority for anyone focused on simple survival. On August 29th and 30th of 1944, before the siege had even properly begun, British bombers conducted 2 devastating raids on Königsberg, targeting the city centre. The raids created firestorms that consumed entire neighbourhoods. The castle was damaged but not destroyed. If the Amber Room was still in the castle at this point, it might have survived these raids, though possibly with damage. But the final destruction came in April of 1945. Soviet forces launched their final assault on the city. Artillery fire reached an intensity that survivors described as apocalyptic. The ground shaking continuously, buildings collapsing from the vibrations alone, dust so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet. The castle, already damaged from earlier bombardment, took direct hits repeatedly, and then the castle caught fire. It might have been from artillery, might have been from Soviet troops using flamethrowers, might have been from burning debris from surrounding buildings. However it started, the fire spread rapidly. The castle's wooden floors and ceilings, dry from centuries of existence, burned intensely. The stone walls contained the inferno, creating an oven that reached temperatures high enough to melt metal, to crack stone, to certainly destroy amber. The fire burned for days. When Soviet forces finally entered the castle ruins, they found a blackened shell. Floors had collapsed into cellars, ceilings had fallen. The interior was a jumbled mass of charred wood, broken stone, melted metal, and ash. If the Amber Room had been in the castle during the fire, nothing recognisable would have remained. Amber burns. It doesn't just char, it actually combusts, turning to smoke and ash, leaving nothing behind but the faintest residue. Alfred Rode, the curator who had overseen the Amber Room during its time in Königsberg, died shortly after the fall of the city, under circumstances that remain unclear. His wife, who survived the war, gave conflicting accounts over the years about what had happened to the room. Sometimes she said it had been destroyed in the fire. Sometimes she suggested it had been evacuated. Her testimonies, given under different circumstances to different questioners, only deepened the mystery. Soviet forces searched the castle ruins thoroughly, looking for treasures, for documents, for anything of value. They found fragments of museum collections, broken pottery, charred paintings, melted sculptures, but they found no amber, no golden panels, no evidence of the room they were specifically seeking. Either it had been destroyed completely, or it had never been there when the castle burned. And with that fire, with that absence of evidence, the Amber Room passed from known history into mythology, from documented fact into endless speculation. The room that had glowed for 2 centuries, that had been stolen and moved and briefly reassembled, was gone. The only question remaining was whether it was truly destroyed or merely hidden, whether we should grieve for its loss or continue searching for its hiding place. In the immediate aftermath of Germany's surrender, while the world was still processing the scale of destruction, while millions of displaced people were trying to find their way home, Soviet authorities began searching for the Amber Room. It was not merely a cultural treasure, it was a symbol of what had been stolen from Russia, and its recovery would have enormous propaganda value. Teams of art specialists and intelligence officers were assembled. They had lists of treasures taken from Soviet museums and palaces, and the Amber Room was at the top. They interrogated German museum officials who had survived the war, searched through castle ruins across Germany, followed every lead no matter how tenuous. The ruins of Königsberg Castle were excavated carefully. Workers sifted through tons of ash and debris, looking for any trace of amber, any evidence that the room had been there when the castle burned or had been moved before the fire. They found fragments of many things, pieces of porcelain, melted bronze, charred wood, but no amber, no panels, no frames, no gold backing. Nothing that could definitively be identified as coming from the Amber Room. This absence of evidence created 2 possible interpretations. The first was that the room had indeed been in the castle when it burned and had been completely destroyed. Amber, when exposed to extreme heat, doesn't leave substantial residue. It burns cleanly, turning to smoke and ash. In a fire hot enough to melt metal and crack stone, amber panels would have been vaporized, leaving nothing to find. The second interpretation was that the room had been evacuated before the siege, shipped somewhere else or hidden in a location that had not yet been searched. This interpretation was encouraged by various testimonies from people who claimed to have seen crates being loaded, who remembered convoys leaving Königsberg in the months before the city fell, who suggested the room might be in a salt mine, in a castle basement, in a sealed tunnel somewhere waiting to be discovered. Soviet searches expanded beyond Königsberg. Teams investigated castles throughout East Prussia and Saxony. They searched salt mines where other artworks had been hidden. They excavated tunnels and bunkers. They followed up reports from German civilians who claimed knowledge of hidden treasures, though many of these leads proved to be either mistaken identities, crates that turned out to contain ordinary furniture or books, not amber panels, or deliberate deceptions by people hoping to gain favour or rewards. Some searches were more systematic than others. In some locations, professionals conducted careful archaeological excavations. In others, soldiers simply dug where they were told to dig, looking for something they wouldn't necessarily recognise if they found it. The chaos of post-war Europe made organised searching difficult. Countries were in ruins, borders were shifting, millions of people were displaced. The Amber Room, however precious, was just one lost object among countless others. By the early 1950s, official Soviet searches had yielded nothing. The team assigned to find the Amber Room was eventually dissolved. The conclusion, though not officially announced, was that the room had most likely been destroyed in the Königsberg fire. Some individuals continued searching privately, following their own theories, but without state support their efforts were limited. The room's disappearance settled into a kind of historical accepted fact. It had existed. It had been stolen. It was probably destroyed. And that was the end of the story. Museums updated their records to list the Amber Room as lost, presumed destroyed in 1945. Histories of the Catherine Palace included its loss as one of the many cultural catastrophes of the Second World War. But the story didn't end there, because absence of proof is not proof of absence, and as long as the room's destruction couldn't be definitively confirmed, as long as there was even the smallest possibility that it might still exist somewhere, people would continue to search. The Amber Room was about to enter a new phase of its existence, not as an actual object that could be visited and admired, but as the subject of obsession, of treasure hunting, of theories ranging from plausible to fantastical. And this brings us into the decades of searching that followed, into the long Twilight period when the Amber Room existed primarily as a mystery, as something lost that might yet be found, waiting somewhere in darkness for someone clever or lucky enough to discover its hiding place. The 1960s and 70s saw the rise of amateur Amber Room hunters, individuals convinced they could succeed where official searches had failed. These were not generally professional archaeologists or art historians. They were enthusiasts, hobbyists, sometimes eccentrics. United by their conviction that the room still existed, and that solving its location was simply a matter of finding the right clues, theories proliferated. Perhaps the most persistent was that the Amber Room had been loaded onto a ship in Königsberg's harbour during the final evacuation attempts in early 1945. Several ships had been sunk in the Baltic while attempting to evacuate civilians and treasures. The Wilhelm Gustloff, torpedoed by a Soviet submarine on January 30, 1945, with the loss of more than 9,000 lives, was sometimes mentioned as a possible location. If the Amber Room had been aboard when it sank, it would be resting now in relatively shallow water, preserved perhaps by the cold and darkness of the Baltic Sea. This theory led to several diving expeditions over the years. Sonar scans identified wrecks. Divers descended into cold darkness, exploring the shattered hulls of German ships. They found human remains, personal effects, military equipment, but no amber, no evidence that the panels had been aboard. The Baltic has claimed many treasures, but apparently not this one. Another persistent theory located the amber room in a salt mine. Germany had used salt mines to hide artworks throughout the war. The stable temperature and humidity made them ideal storage locations, and their depth made them relatively safe from bombing. The salt mines near Merkers in Thuringia had yielded enormous quantities of stolen art when discovered by American forces in April of 1945. Perhaps another mine, not yet searched or incompletely searched, contained the amber panels. This theory sent treasure hunters into abandoned mines across Germany, and later Poland and the Czech Republic as those countries opened up to Western researchers. They explored sealed passages, excavated collapsed tunnels, searched chambers that hadn't seen light since the war. The searches were often dangerous. Mines flood, walls collapse, air quality can be lethal. Some searchers died in pursuit of the room. Others gave up after years of fruitless excavation. A third theory, more subtle and perhaps more plausible, suggested that the amber room had been disassembled and dispersed. The individual panels or groups of panels had been taken by different people during the chaos of the war's end. Perhaps a Nazi official had claimed some pieces as personal loot. Perhaps Soviet soldiers had taken amber as souvenirs without realizing what they had. Perhaps German civilians had hidden panels during the occupation, intending to return them later, but dying before they could do so. This theory would explain why the room was never found intact. It didn't exist intact anymore. It had been scattered, pieces in attics and basements across Europe, some destroyed, some lost, some waiting in unmarked boxes in storage facilities or private homes. This theory made finding the room essentially impossible, because it would require locating dozens or hundreds of separate pieces, many of which might be unrecognizable or already destroyed. Occasionally, pieces of amber did surface that some hoped might be from the room. A panel would appear in an estate sale, or a fragment would be found during building renovation. Each would be examined carefully, compared to photographs of the original room, analysed for age and origin. Almost always they proved to be unrelated. Amber items certainly, sometimes valuable ones, but not from the amber room. The few pieces that couldn't be immediately dismissed remained subjects of debate. In 1997, German police raiding the home of someone suspected of dealing in stolen art found a chess panel that appeared to match photographic evidence of one of the amber room's decorative elements. The panel was confirmed as authentic, a piece that had actually been part of Catherine's room. But it was just one small piece, and its discovery raised as many questions as it answered. How had it been separated from the rest of the room? Where were the other panels? Did this prove the room had been dispersed, or was this piece an anomaly? The discovery renewed interest in the search, brought new funding for expeditions, encouraged people who had been losing hope. But it also demonstrated the challenge of finding something that might exist in fragments, scattered across a continent, hidden in places no systematic search could ever cover completely. And so the searches continued, decade after decade, hope sustained by the conviction that something so beautiful couldn't simply be gone, that somewhere, somehow, the golden panels were waiting in darkness to be brought back into light. By the early 1980s, Soviet authorities had reached a conclusion that was equal parts acceptance and defiance. The original amber room was most likely destroyed. The searches had gone on long enough without success. The evidence pointed toward the room having burned in Königsberg Castle in 1945, consumed completely by the fire that had gutted the building. But rather than let this loss stand as a permanent absence, rather than leave the Catherine Palace with an empty room or a space filled with something else, they made a remarkable decision. They would recreate the amber room. They would build it again from scratch, using the same materials, the same techniques, guided by photographs and descriptions and the expertise of craftspeople who understood how amber could be worked. This was not an attempt to fake the original, or to pretend the loss hadn't occurred. This would be an acknowledged recreation, a tribute to what had been lost, and also a demonstration that Russian craftsmanship could achieve what 18th century craftsmen had achieved. If Prussia could create the Amber Room once, Russia could create it again. The decision was announced in 1982. A team of specialists was assembled. Amber artisans, art historians, chemists, engineers, designers. They gathered every photograph of the original room they could find, studied the few surviving pieces, consulted with elderly craftspeople who remembered seeing the room before the war. They needed to understand not just what the room had looked like, but how it had been constructed, what techniques had been used, what tools and methods would be required to recreate it. The first challenge was sourcing amber of sufficient quality and quantity. They would need approximately 6 tons of amber, just as the original room had used. This amber needed to be carefully selected, the right colour, the right clarity, free of major flaws. Baltic amber was still being harvested, but finding such large quantities of high-quality pieces would take years. Amber artisans began collecting suitable pieces, buying them from suppliers, sometimes waiting years for particular colours or clarities to become available. Each piece was evaluated carefully. Some would be used as larger panels, others would be cut into smaller pieces for the mosaic work. Still others would be carved into decorative elements or used as filler in areas where absolute clarity wasn't essential. The second challenge was recreating the techniques. 18th century amber working had been done with tools and methods that were not well documented. The craftspeople had to experiment, had to rediscover through trial and error how to cut amber without cracking it, how to polish it to the right finish, how to back it with gold leaf for maximum glow, how to fit the pieces together into stable panels. This meant considerable waste. Amber would crack during cutting, experiments with backing materials would fail, panels would be assembled and then have to be disassembled because they didn't match photographs of the original closely enough. The work was painstaking, frustrating, occasionally heartbreaking when days or weeks of work would be lost to a single mistake or an unexpected flaw in a key piece. But slowly, piece by piece, the new Amber Room began to take shape. The first panels were completed in the mid-1980s. They were displayed to the public, generating enormous interest. People who had never seen the original room, who knew it only from photographs and descriptions, came to see amber panels glowing against walls, to watch craftspeople fitting tiny pieces into intricate designs. The work continued through the collapse of the Soviet Union, through the economic chaos of the early 1990s, through periods when funding disappeared and it seemed the project might be abandoned. But it persisted, carried forward by the dedication of the craftspeople involved, by the conviction that this recreation mattered, that beauty lost could be beauty remade. By the mid-1990s, significant portions of the room were complete. Visitors to the Catherine Palace could see amber panels being installed, could watch the room gradually coming back into existence. It wasn't the original, would never be the original, but it was magnificent in its own right, a demonstration that craftsmanship transcends individual objects, that knowledge passed down through generations can recreate what was thought lost forever. The recreation would eventually be completed in 2003, inaugurated on the 300th anniversary of the founding of St. Petersburg. But even before completion, its existence had changed the story of the Amber Room. The room was no longer only a loss, only an absence. It was also a phoenix, something reborn, something that existed again not despite its destruction, but almost because of it. Let's pause here with this image. Craftspeople fitting tiny pieces of amber into frames, light beginning to glow again from walls, beauty being painstakingly restored by hands that never touched the original, but understood its principles, its purpose, its meaning. While the recreation was being built in Russia, the search for the original Amber Room continued in Germany and across Europe, driven by individuals for whom the mystery had become a consuming obsession. These were people who had dedicated years, sometimes decades, to following leads, excavating sites, pursuing theories that range from meticulously researched to wildly speculative. One of the most dedicated searchers was Georg Stein, a German art detective and lawyer who spent more than 30 years investigating the Amber Room's disappearance. Stein approached the mystery systematically, interviewing surviving witnesses, analysing documents from wartime archives, mapping out where trains and convoys had travelled in the final months of the war. He believed the room had been evacuated from Königsberg and hidden somewhere in central Germany, possibly in a bunker or mine that had been sealed and then forgotten. Stein's theory led him to a site near Dresden where he believed the room might be buried in a sealed tunnel beneath a castle. He obtained permissions, secured funding, assembled an excavation team. They spent months carefully digging, following ground-penetrating radar results that suggested void spaces beneath the castle grounds. What they found were tunnels, yes, and chambers, but empty ones, or filled with debris that had nothing to do with the Amber Room. The search cost Stein years of his life and significant personal resources. He died in 2037, still convinced the room existed somewhere, still believing he had been close to finding it. Other searchers faced darker consequences. The search for the Amber Room had always attracted not just historians and treasure hunters, but also criminals who saw the room as a source of potential profit. If the panels could be found and sold on the black market, they would be worth millions, possibly hundreds of millions. This criminal interest made the search dangerous. In 1987, two treasure hunters, one a former German soldier named Karl-Heinz Kleine, and the other a Russian archaeologist named Yuri Gusev, announced they had found evidence pointing to the room's location in a bunker near Berlin. Shortly after this announcement, both men were found dead under circumstances ruled accidental, but considered suspicious by those who knew them. Their notes and research materials disappeared. Whatever they had discovered, if anything, died with them. The Amber Room developed a reputation as cursed, as dangerous to pursue. Several people connected to searches died in accidents, car crashes, falls during excavations, sudden illnesses. Rational analysis would suggest these were coincidences, the unfortunate but statistically inevitable results of elderly people engaging in physically demanding and sometimes dangerous activities over decades of searching. But the pattern fed conspiracy theories. Suggestions that someone didn't want the room found, that powerful interests were working to keep its location secret. These deaths did not stop the searches. If anything, they added urgency, a sense that time was running out, that the generation who might remember crucial details was dying off. Each death of a witness who had been in Königsberg during the war, each passing of a museum official who might have known something about the room's evacuation, narrowed the window for finding testimony that could solve the mystery. The financial cost of searching was also substantial. Excavations are expensive. Ground-penetrating radar, archaeological teams, permissions and permits. Equipment rental. A single search of a promising site could cost tens of thousands of dollars or more. Some searchers bankrupted themselves pursuing the Amber Room. Others spent inheritances, took out loans, convinced investors to fund expeditions that yielded nothing. And the psychological cost perhaps exceeded even the financial. To dedicate your life to searching for something that might not exist, to pursue lead after lead that ends in disappointment, to face skepticism and ridicule from people who think you're chasing a phantom, this takes a toll that's hard to measure. Some searchers became isolated, relationships strained or broken by the obsession, families estranged by the conviction that just one more search would succeed where all previous attempts had failed. Yet they continued. The searchers shared information, formed networks, attended conferences where they presented theories and evidence. Some cooperation existed, but also competition, secrecy, the fear that sharing information might let someone else make the discovery first. The community of Amber Room searchers was simultaneously collaborative and suspicious, united by their goal, but divided by their methods, and their conviction that they alone understood the crucial detail everyone else had missed. By the early 2000s, the number of active searchers had diminished. Many had died, some had given up. Others had simply exhausted the locations available to search. The consensus among historians was increasingly that the room had been destroyed, that the search was futile, that energy and resources would be better spent on other lost treasures with better chances of recovery. But obsession doesn't respond to logic, and a core of searchers remained, convinced that somewhere in the fragments of memory and documentation and physical evidence, there was a pattern that would reveal where the amber room had gone, where it might still be waiting to be brought back into the light. The history of the amber room search is littered with moments of hope that turned into profound disappointment. Sites that seemed promising based on documentary evidence or witness testimony yielded nothing when actually excavated. Theories that appeared solid crumbled when examined more closely. The pattern repeated so often it became almost ritualistic. Excitement, investigation, disappointment, recalibration, and on to the next lead. One particularly elaborate false lead emerged in the mid-1990s when a German researcher claimed to have decoded messages in old photographs of the amber room. He argued that the arrangement of amber panels contained clues, deliberate patterns that pointed to where the room would be hidden if evacuation became necessary. He published his findings, complete with complex diagrams and analysis of panel positions, creating significant media interest. Excavations were launched at sites his theory indicated: a forest clearing in Saxony, a basement in what had been East Prussia but was now Poland, a sealed vault beneath a church. Each excavation was carefully documented, each progressed through soil and stone and time, reaching the depths where the theory suggested treasures would be found, and each found nothing. The photographs contained no secret code. The patterns were coincidental, artifacts of how the panels happened to fit together in a Baroque design, not intentional clues to future hiding places. Another false lead came from a deathbed confession in 1998. An elderly man who had been a German soldier during the war told his family he had been part of a team that had buried something important near his hometown in Bavaria. The description matched what the amber room might have been if packed in crates. The family contacted authorities, who contacted researchers, who organised a search. The excavation found buried crates, which generated enormous excitement. Media descended on the small town. Cameras recorded the careful opening of wooden boxes that had been underground for more than 50 years. Inside were books, a library collection from a destroyed university, carefully packed and buried for safekeeping. Valuable, certainly, but not the amber room. The soldier had been part of that burial detail, but had confused or merged details with stories he'd heard about other treasures being hidden. Some false leads came from deliberate deception. In 2000, someone approached a British auction house with several amber panels they claimed were from the original amber room. The panels were old, were beautiful, were indeed Baltic amber worked in a Baroque style. Experts were called in, tests were conducted. For several weeks there was cautious optimism that at least part of the room had been found. Detailed analysis revealed the panels were authentic 18th century work, but not from the amber room. They were from a different commission, perhaps a different palace room somewhere else in Europe, similar in style but not identical to the panels that had gone missing. Someone had either honestly confused them for the missing treasure, or was deliberately attempting to profit from the confusion. The most heartbreaking false leads were perhaps those where families discovered amber pieces in attics or storage spaces left by deceased relatives who had been in Germany during or after the war. These discoveries would spark hope. Perhaps a soldier had taken a piece as a souvenir. Perhaps a civilian had rescued fragments from the ruins. Each piece was analysed, compared to photographic records, tested for age and composition. Almost always they proved to be amber items, but not from the amber room. Sometimes they were souvenirs from the Baltic region, commercially produced items that happened to be old. Sometimes they were pieces from other amber decorative objects common in German and Russian households in the early 20th century. The few pieces that couldn't be definitively ruled out remained catalogued as, quote, 1, but insufficient to solve the mystery or indicate where the rest of the room might be. These accumulated disappointments had a cumulative effect on the search community. Each false lead meant resources expended for no result, meant time and money and hope invested in a possibility that turned out to be nothing. The emotional toll was substantial. Some searchers became increasingly skeptical, requiring more evidence before committing to an excavation. Others became more desperate, pursuing ever more speculative theories, seeing patterns where none existed, convinced that the next search, surely the next search, would be the one that succeeded. Historians and archaeologists not personally involved in the search grew increasingly convinced that the Amber Room had been destroyed. The pattern of false leads, the absence of any credible evidence that it had survived, the fact that every promising theory had failed when tested, all pointed toward acceptance that the room was gone. They argued that continued searching was a waste of resources, that the mystery had been solved even if the answer was disappointing. The room had burned in Königsberg Castle in April of 1945, but as long as destruction couldn't be definitively proved, as long as there was even a theoretical possibility that the room existed somewhere, searches continued. Hope, once kindled, is extraordinarily difficult to extinguish completely. And the Amber Room was beautiful enough, mysterious enough, valuable enough to keep that hope alive despite decades of disappointment. Let that pattern settle as we move forward. The cycle of hope and disappointment, the searching and the failure to find, the question that wouldn't be answered continuing to echo through decades, through generations, through the persistent human inability to accept that something so beautiful might truly be gone forever. Over the decades since its disappearance, the Amber Room transformed from a lost artwork into something larger and stranger, a cultural phenomenon, a symbol, a screen onto which people projected meanings that had little to do with amber panels and everything to do with human needs for mystery, for hope, for quests that might still be won. In popular culture, the Amber Room became a staple of treasure hunting fiction. Novels used it as a MacGuffin, the object that drives the plot, the treasure that heroes and villains compete to find. These fictional accounts mixed real historical details with invented conspiracies, creating elaborate scenarios where the room had been hidden by secret Nazi organizations, or discovered by Soviet intelligence and kept secret for political reasons, or protected by families who had guarded it through generations. These stories bore little relationship to historical probability, but they kept the Amber Room in public consciousness, introduced each new generation to the mystery, created a romanticized version of the search that was more exciting than the often tedious reality of archaeological investigation and archival research. Documentaries explored the mystery from every possible angle. Each documentary promised new evidence, new theories, exclusive access to witnesses or documents that would finally solve the puzzle. They followed searchers into mines and bunkers. They interviewed historians and treasure hunters. They presented ground-penetrating radar results with dramatic music suggesting revelation was imminent. And each ended the same way, with the mystery unresolved, with the promise that perhaps next time, with better equipment or one more witness interview, the answer would emerge. The Amber Room became useful as a metaphor. It represented lost beauty, vanished civilizations, the costs of war, the persistence of mystery in an age that claimed to explain everything. Writers and artists who had never seen the room and had no particular interest in finding it invoked it symbolically, using its disappearance to comment on loss, memory, the impossibility of truly recovering what time has taken. This metaphorical use was especially common in post-Soviet Russia, where the Amber Room stood for everything that had been lost in the 20th century: imperial grandeur, cultural continuity, a sense of unbroken connection to the past. Its recreation became equally symbolic, a statement that some things could be rebuilt, that knowledge and craftsmanship persisted even when specific objects didn't, that beauty could be reborn. The mystery also became entangled with darker elements of post-war history. The Amber Room's disappearance coincided with the larger story of Nazi art theft. Hundreds of thousands of artworks stolen from Jewish families, from museums, from churches, from private collections across occupied Europe. Most of these artworks were never recovered. Many were destroyed. Others remain in private hands, their ownership contested, their provenance deliberately obscured. In this context, searching for the Amber Room became connected to the broader effort to recover and return stolen art, to acknowledge what had been taken, to restore what could be restored. The room's Russian origin made its theft particularly symbolic. This wasn't art stolen from a powerless individual or family, but from a nation. A crime at a different scale, but part of the same systematic plunder. Some researchers argued that focusing so much attention on one spectacular missing object distracted from the thousands of other items still lost, still needing to be documented and searched for. Why, they asked, did the Amber Room receive such sustained attention when countless other treasures remained unlocated and largely forgotten? The answer was perhaps that the Amber Room was spectacular enough to capture imagination, mysterious enough to sustain interest, and just plausible enough in its possible survival to keep hope alive. As the 20th century ended and the 21st began, the Amber Room mystery entered a new phase. The generation who had lived through the war, who might have witnessed crucial events, had largely died. The reconstruction in Russia was nearing completion. The most obvious places had been searched multiple times. What remained was either acceptance that the room was lost, or increasingly speculative theories about hiding places that had somehow evaded decades of investigation. The mystery had become, in a sense, self-sustaining. It existed now not primarily as a historical question with a determinable answer, but as a cultural phenomenon, a story that people told and retold, each telling adding new details, new theories, new meanings. The actual Amber Room, whether destroyed or hidden, had become almost secondary to the Amber Room as idea, as symbol, as eternal mystery. And perhaps there's something appropriate in that transformation. The room was created to be beautiful, to inspire awe, to represent human capability at its finest. In its absence, it continued to do those things, just differently. It inspired not awe at seeing it, but awe at imagining it. It represented not achieved beauty, but beauty lost and mourned. And it demonstrated not human capability to create, but human persistence to search, to hope, to believe that even the longest odds might occasionally pay off. This is what the mystery became, less about amber and more about us, about what we value, what we hope for, what we refuse to accept as finally and irrevocably gone. The men and women who recreated the Amber Room were specialists in a craft that had nearly died out, artisans who had learned to work amber in ways that few people still understood. Their work required not just skill, but patience, a willingness to spend years, sometimes decades, perfecting techniques, accepting failures, starting over when necessary. Alexander Jуравлев became the lead craftsman for the project in the early 1990s. He had studied amber working under older masters who remembered pre-war techniques, who had learned from craftspeople who had themselves learned from an unbroken chain reaching back generations. This transmission of knowledge was fragile, dependent on individuals willing to spend years in apprenticeship, learning through observation and practice rather than written instructions. Jуравлев's team started small, with simple panels that would help them understand the material. Amber is not uniform. Each piece has different hardness, different internal stresses, different responses to tools. What works for cutting one piece will crack another. The only way to learn is through experience, through cutting and polishing thousands of pieces until intuition develops, until hands know before eyes see whether a particular piece will cooperate or resist. The team worked in a dedicated workshop in Tsarskoye Selo, near the Catherine Palace, where the recreated room would eventually be installed. The workshop became a kind of temple to patience, a space where time moved differently, where rushing was impossible, where the work demanded complete attention and absolute care. Visitors who came to watch the craftspeople often commented on the intensity of concentration, the stillness broken only by the careful sounds of cutting and filing and polishing. Each panel required hundreds of hours of work. The craftspeople would start with large pieces of amber, selected for colour and clarity. These would be cut into smaller sections, shaped to fit specific parts of the overall design. Each cut risked cracking the amber, splitting it along internal stress lines that were invisible until the piece broke. Experience reduced this risk but never eliminated it completely. Once cut to approximate shape, each piece had to be ground and polished. This process revealed the amber's true colour, removed surface oxidation, created the clarity needed for pieces that would be backed with gold. The polishing was done by hand using increasingly fine abrasives, working from rough to smooth over hours of careful attention. A single small piece might be polished for half a day before it achieved the exact finish required. The pieces then had to be assembled into panels. This required understanding the original design, matching the Baroque patterns visible in photographs, recreating scrollwork and flowers and decorative elements from two-dimensional images. The craftspeople became experts at reading historical photographs, at inferring three-dimensional structure from shadows and highlights, at understanding how the original panels had been constructed, even though they couldn't examine them directly. Backing the amber with gold leaf presented its own challenges. The gold had to be applied to the reverse of each amber piece, creating a reflective surface that would make the amber glow when light passed through from the front. Too much adhesive would discolour the amber. Too little would allow the gold to separate. The technique required delicate balance, learned through trial and error, refined through countless applications until the craftspeople could achieve consistent results. Failures were common, especially in early years. A panel would be nearly complete when a crucial piece would crack, requiring dismantling the entire section and starting over. Experiments with backing techniques would fail, damaging amber that had taken weeks to prepare. Tools would slip, scratches would appear, pieces would be cut slightly wrong, and wouldn't fit properly in the overall design. Each failure taught something. The craftspeople kept careful notes, documented what worked and what didn't, slowly building a knowledge base that would have been familiar to 18th century amber masters, but had been lost in the centuries since. They were not just recreating an object, but recovering a craft, rebuilding expertise that had nearly vanished. The work was physically demanding. Hours spent bent over workbenches affected backs and necks. The fine detail work strained eyes. Amber dust, created by cutting and grinding, had to be carefully managed to prevent respiratory problems. The craftspeople worked in shifts, taking breaks, rotating between tasks to prevent repetitive stress injuries. But they persisted. Year after year, panel after panel, the rooms slowly emerged from their patience and skill. What had once existed was being brought back into being through dedication that mirrored the dedication of the original craftspeople. Different hands creating the same beauty across centuries, proving that some knowledge, some capabilities, transcend individual lifetimes and persist through human commitment to excellence. The recreated Amber Room was officially opened on May 31st, 2003, exactly 300 years after Peter the Great founded St. Petersburg. The timing was deliberate, connecting the room's return to the city's anniversary, making the recreation part of a larger celebration of Russian culture and resilience. The opening ceremony was attended by Russian President Vladimir Putin and German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, a pairing that carried significant symbolic weight. Germany and Russia, countries whose conflict had led to the original room's destruction, were now united in celebrating its recreation. Schröder's presence represented German acknowledgement of cultural crimes committed during the war. Putin's presence emphasized Russia's cultural achievement in recreating what had been lost. Thousands of people lined up to see the room on its opening day. They waited hours for the opportunity to spend a few minutes inside to see what their grandparents or great-grandparents might have seen. To stand in a space that glowed with amber light just as the original had glowed. The line stretched through the Catherine Palace, out into the grounds, people patient despite the wait, understanding they were witnessing something remarkable. When visitors entered the room, the first reaction was almost always silence. The glow was overwhelming. The sense of being inside captured light as powerful as descriptions had promised. The walls seemed to breathe warmth. The mirrors multiplied the amber into infinite reflections. The intricate Baroque designs revealed themselves slowly. Scrollwork here, florals there, geometric patterns, organic forms, all rendered in shades of gold from pale honey to deep amber. Some visitors wept. They had grown up hearing about the lost amber room, had seen photographs of the original, had mourned its destruction as part of the larger cultural catastrophe of the war. To see it reborn, to stand inside beauty that had seemed permanently lost, was emotionally overwhelming. The room represented not just artistic achievement, but recovery, the possibility that what war destroys, peace can rebuild. Others examined the room with careful attention, comparing what they saw to historical photographs, appreciating the craftsmanship, recognizing the extraordinary skill required to create something so complex. These visitors understood the achievement not just aesthetically but technically, could appreciate what years of dedicated work had accomplished. The recreation was not perfect. Experts could identify differences from the original, panels arranged slightly differently, some decorative elements simplified, modern materials used in some backing and support structures. But these differences were minor, noticeable only to specialists comparing directly to historical documentation. For most visitors, the room was what it needed to be: magnificent, golden, inspiring, a space that transcended its function as museum room and became an experience of beauty as overwhelming as beauty can be. Media coverage was extensive. News outlets from around the world reported on the opening, many using it as an occasion to tell the full story of the original room's creation, disappearance, and recreation. The coverage introduced new generations to the Amber Room's history, ensured that the story would continue being told, that future visitors would arrive with context and understanding. The opening also marked an ending of sorts for the searchers who had spent decades looking for the original. Some attended the ceremony, their feelings complicated. Joy at seeing the room exist again mixed with sadness that the original remained lost, perhaps confirmation that their searches had been futile, that what they had sought for so long was indeed destroyed and beyond recovery. Others refused to accept the recreation as closure. The existence of the new room, they argued, didn't prove the original was destroyed, only that Russia had stopped waiting for it to be found. They would continue searching, continue believing that somewhere, somehow, the original panels waited in darkness would someday be brought back into light. But for most people, the recreation provided a kind of satisfaction, an ending to a story that had lacked closure. The Amber Room existed again. It could be visited, admired, experienced. Whatever had happened to the original, whatever its fate had been, this iteration would endure. It would not disappear. It would not burn. It would glow in the Catherine Palace for centuries to come, a testament to human artistry and to the persistence of beauty even after catastrophic loss. The room opened, visitors walked through golden light, and somewhere in that light was both the acknowledgement of what had been lost and the celebration of what had been reclaimed through patience, skill, and an unwillingness to let beauty disappear permanently from the world. After more than 80 years of searching, investigating, theorizing, and hoping, it's worth pausing to consider what we actually know about the Amber Room's fate, separating confirmed facts from speculation, distinguishing between what evidence supports and what people merely wish were true. We know the room was created in Prussia in the early 1700s by Andreas Schlüter and Gottfried Wolfram for Frederick I. We have contemporary accounts of this creation, bills of purchase for amber, contracts with craftsmen. This part of the story is well documented and uncontested. We know the panels were gifted to Peter the Great in 1716 and transported to Russia, where they were eventually installed in the Catherine Palace and augmented under Catherine the Great into the room that became famous. Again, this is documented through palace records, contemporary accounts, inventories. We have photographs of the room from the early 20th century showing its appearance before the war. We know German forces occupied the Catherine Palace in September of 1941, and that specialists dismantled the amber room carefully over approximately 36 hours. We have German records of this operation, photographs of the dismantling process, testimony from witnesses both German and Soviet. This isn't speculation. It happened, and the documentation is clear. We know the panels were transported to Königsberg and reassembled in the Castle Museum by early 1942. We have photographs of the room in Königsberg showing it partially reassembled, German records mentioning it, accounts from people who visited it there. The room existed in Königsberg, this is certain. What becomes uncertain is what happened after August of 1944. When the room was last definitively seen, Alfred Rode, the curator, reportedly began packing amber panels in crates that month, but we don't know if he finished this packing, if the crates were shipped, where they might have been sent if they were. We know Königsberg Castle was heavily damaged by British bombing in August of 1944 before the final siege. We know it was further damaged during the Soviet assault on the city in April of 1945, and that it burned extensively during this assault. Soviet forces found the castle gutted, with floors collapsed and interiors destroyed. This is documented through military records and witness testimony. We know extensive searches of the castle ruins found no trace of amber panels, no evidence the room had been in the castle when it burned. This absence of evidence is important but not conclusive. It could mean the room was evacuated before the fire, or it could mean the room burned completely, leaving no recognisable remains. We know that various searches over subsequent decades have found no credible evidence that the room survived. No intact panels have been discovered. No convoy of crates matching the description has been located in mines or bunkers or warehouses. The few amber pieces that have surfaced and been authenticated as possibly from the original room are fragments, insufficient to indicate where the rest might be. We know one piece was definitively recovered, the chest panel found in Germany in 1997. This proves at least some small portions of the room survived separately from the main installation. But one piece out of the thousands that made up the complete room tells us very little about the fate of the rest. What we don't know, despite decades of investigation, is what actually happened to the amber room after August of 1944. The most likely scenario, based on the absence of evidence and the destruction of Königsberg Castle, is that the room was still in the castle when it burned and was completely destroyed. Amber burns cleanly in intense heat, leaving minimal residue. A fire hot enough to melt metal and crack stone would have vaporized amber panels entirely. But this remains supposition, not proven fact. We cannot definitively state the room was destroyed because we have no physical evidence of that destruction. The absence of remains could mean complete destruction, or could mean successful evacuation and continued hiding. Without conclusive proof, both possibilities remain technically viable. However unlikely the second might be, this uncertainty is what has sustained searches for so long. If we knew the room was destroyed, if we had documentation of its burning or photographs of amber ash, the question would be settled. But we have absence, ambiguity, a trail that goes cold in August of 1944 and never resumes with certainty. What we're left with is probability rather than proof, likelihood rather than certainty. The amber room probably burned in Königsberg Castle in April of 1945, but probably leaves room for possibly not, and that small remaining possibility is enough to keep the mystery alive to justify continued belief that somewhere, somehow, the original panels might still exist. This is the frustrating and fascinating truth of the Amber Room. We know so much about it except the one thing that matters most: what actually happened to it in the end. Perhaps the Amber Room's greatest achievement is not what it was, but what its loss has meant. The ways it has functioned as a symbol for broader truths about art, war, memory, and time. The room represents the vulnerability of beauty in times of conflict. No matter how magnificent something is, no matter how many hours of skilled work went into its creation, no matter how irreplaceable it seems, it can be destroyed in moments when the world descends into violence. War is efficient at destroying what took decades or centuries to build. The Amber Room is one example among thousands. Buildings bombed, paintings burned, sculptures shattered, libraries reduced to ash. But the Amber Room has come to stand for all these losses because it was spectacular enough to be remembered, valuable enough to be mourned, mysterious enough to haunt imaginations. It became the face of cultural destruction in the Second World War, representing not just its own loss, but the loss of countless other treasures, most of which will never be recreated, never be searched for, never even be fully catalogued or remembered. The loss also represents the limits of power. Nazi Germany at the height of its expansion could steal the Amber Room, could dismantle and transport it, could reassemble it in Königsberg as a trophy of conquest. But that same power could not protect it when the tide of war turned, could not preserve it when their own empire began collapsing. The greatest military machine of its era could not save a room full of amber from being destroyed or lost in the chaos of their own defeat. There's something almost cosmic in that irony. The regime that stole the room as proof of its invincibility lost it as proof of its ultimate powerlessness. What they took to demonstrate their strength became evidence of their failure. The Amber Room outlasted the Nazis by existing in memory and eventually in recreation, while the 1,000-year Reich lasted 12 years and ended in ruins. The recreation carries its own meanings. It demonstrates that some things can be rebuilt, that knowledge transmitted carefully through generations can recreate what seemed permanently lost. The craftspeople who rebuilt the Amber Room proved that human skill persists, that what one generation of artisans achieved, another generation can achieve again if they're willing to dedicate themselves to the same standards of excellence. But the recreation also acknowledges limits. It is not the original. It cannot be the original. The amber is different amber, harvested centuries after the original pieces were gathered. The craftspeople, however skilled, were working from photographs and descriptions, not direct experience with the techniques used in the 1800s. The new room is magnificent, but it's magnificent in a different way, carrying the weight of its own history, the history of its recreation rather than its original creation. This distinction matters philosophically. The recreated room teaches us that you can rebuild beauty, but you cannot fully recover it. What is lost carries with it the irreplaceable quality of having been the original, of having existed in its time, of having been touched and admired by people whose world no longer exists. The new Amber Room is wonderful, but it is not the room Catherine the Great walked through, is not the panels that glowed for 2 centuries in the Catherine Palace, is not the object that Nazi Germany stole and that vanished into the chaos of 1945. The mystery of what happened teaches us about human nature's relationship with the unknown. We want answers, we want closure, we want mysteries solved, questions answered, stories completed with definitive endings. The Amber Room refuses to give us that satisfaction. It disappeared into ambiguity and has remained there despite our best efforts to drag it back into certainty. This refusal is uncomfortable, but it's also somehow appropriate. Life often lacks the closure we crave. Questions frequently go unanswered. Mysteries remain mysterious despite investigation. The Amber Room, in its stubbornness about being found or definitively confirmed as destroyed, mirrors this larger truth about existence, that some things simply remain unknown, that uncertainty is a permanent condition we must learn to accept. The searchers who dedicated their lives to finding the room were not necessarily foolish, though their quest may have been futile. They were demonstrating something essentially human, the unwillingness to accept loss without fighting against it, the conviction that effort and determination can overcome even the longest odds, the belief that beauty matters enough to spend a lifetime seeking it. Whether the original amber room exists or not, whether it burned or remains hidden, it has achieved a kind of immortality through its loss. It is remembered, discussed, searched for, recreated, written about, filmed, imagined. More people know about the Amber Room now than knew about it when it existed intact in the Catherine Palace. Its fame grew from its disappearance, its meaning expanded through its absence. This suggests something profound about value and meaning. The room matters not primarily because of the intrinsic worth of amber and gold, not even because of the skill required to create it, but because it represents something beyond itself. Beauty as a human value, art as worthy of preservation, the past as something we refuse to simply forget and move on from. The loss is real, and the grief about that loss is appropriate. But the loss has also created meaning that the room's continued existence might not have generated. This is the strange paradox at the heart of the Amber Room story, that its disappearance made it matter more, made it mean more, made it more significant than its mere presence might have been. More than 80 years after the Amber Room disappeared, the world has settled into a kind of equilibrium regarding its fate. Official searches have ended. Most historians accept that the room was probably destroyed. The recreation exists in the Catherine Palace, receiving hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, fulfilling the room's function of inspiring awe and wonder, even if it isn't the original panels doing the inspiring. But small pockets of searching continue. Individual researchers still pursue theories, still believe they've identified the crucial detail everyone else has missed. These modern searchers are fewer than in previous decades, working with less institutional support, facing skepticism not just from academics but from the general public that has largely accepted the room's destruction. Yet they persist, driven by the same conviction that has driven searchers for 80 years, that something so beautiful cannot simply be gone, that the mystery must have a solution. The internet has changed the nature of searching in some ways. Information is more accessible, historical documents have been digitized, photographs can be examined at high resolution, researchers can collaborate across continents without travelling. But the internet has also created noise, allowed conspiracy theories to flourish, made it difficult to distinguish credible research from speculation without basis. Forums exist where people discuss the Amber Room, share theories, argue about evidence. Some participants have spent years in this research. Others are casual enthusiasts who've read articles and formed opinions. The quality of discussion varies wildly, from careful historical analysis to elaborate fantasies involving secret Nazi technology and hidden bases. The Amber Room, like many mysteries, attracts both serious scholarship and wild imagination, and the internet gives both equal platform. Contemporary searches, when they occur, use technologies that previous generations couldn't access. Ground-penetrating radar has improved dramatically, able to detect voids and anomalies underground with greater precision. Satellite imaging can identify potential sites from above. Chemical analysis can determine the age and origin of amber fragments with extraordinary accuracy. These tools haven't found the Amber Room, but they've made searching more efficient, able to rule out locations more quickly than manual excavation allowed. Yet the fundamental problem remains unchanged. You can only search where you have permission and reasonable cause to believe something might be. Germany, Poland, Russia, all have laws protecting archaeological sites, restricting excavation, requiring permits and oversight. You cannot simply start digging anywhere a theory suggests, and even with perfect technology, if the room was destroyed, no amount of sophisticated searching will find it. The official position of Russian authorities is that the original room was destroyed and that the recreation is now the Amber Room. This isn't said to discourage searching, but to manage expectations, to ensure that the recreated room is understood as valid and valuable in its own right, not merely a placeholder waiting for the original to be found. German authorities acknowledge the theft and express regret, but maintain that they have conducted thorough searches of all likely locations and found nothing. They cooperate with researchers who have serious leads, but don't actively fund searching anymore. The assumption is that if the room existed in Germany, decades of looking would have located it by now. Poland, which controls territory that was East Prussia where Königsberg stood, has similar policies. Researchers can apply for permits to search specific sites with credible justification. But the government doesn't organise or fund searches, having concluded that the room was either destroyed or never in Polish territory to begin with. This governmental consensus creates a situation where serious searching is difficult but not impossible. A researcher with a genuinely new theory, backed by solid historical analysis, can still obtain permissions and funding for a search. But the burden of proof is high, the resources available are limited, and the expectation of success is minimal. For most people, the Amber Room has transitioned from active mystery to historical curiosity. It's a fascinating story from the past, an example of wartime destruction and cultural loss, but not a live question requiring resolution. The recreation satisfies the desire to see what the room looked like. The historical record satisfies the desire to understand what happened, at least in broad strokes. The absence of the original is regrettable but accepted. Yet acceptance is not universal. As long as the room's destruction remains unproven, as long as there's even the smallest theoretical possibility that it survived, some people will refuse to accept its loss as final. This is human nature. We want happy endings, want lost things found, want mysteries solved with satisfying answers. The Amber Room may never give us that satisfaction, but the wanting doesn't disappear just because satisfaction is unlikely. And so we find ourselves here, in an era where the Amber Room exists in recreation, is lost in original form, is remembered in story, and is searched for by a diminishing but persistent few who believe that the next excavation, the next theory, the next piece of evidence might finally reveal where the golden panels have been hiding all this time, waiting in darkness for someone clever or lucky enough to bring them back into the light. The recreated Amber Room draws visitors from around the world, people whose reasons for coming are as varied as their backgrounds, each bringing their own relationship to beauty, to history, to loss and recovery. Some visitors are elderly Russians who remember the stories their grandparents told about the original room, who grew up understanding the Amber Room as a symbol of Imperial Russia's grandeur, something that existed in family memory even if they never saw it themselves. These visitors often spend the longest time in the room standing quietly, absorbing not just what they're seeing but what it represents, a connection to a past that the Soviet era tried to erase, a Russia that existed before revolution, before war, before everything changed. They remember being told about amber walls that glowed like captured sunlight, about rooms so beautiful they made visitors weep, about an empire that could commission such magnificence because it believed it would last forever. Standing in the recreated room, they're seeing not just amber panels but their grandparents' world, a time when the Catherine Palace was a summer residence for Tsars, when the social order seemed permanent, when no one imagined that within a few decades it would all be swept away. Other visitors are younger, Russian or from former Soviet states, who come with less personal connection but strong cultural interest. For them, the Amber Room represents something about Russian identity, about their country's artistic achievements, about the sophistication of Russian culture that Western narratives sometimes ignore or minimize. They take photographs, spend time reading the informational plaques, try to understand the techniques used to create the panels. They're proud of what their country has recreated, proud of the craftsmanship, pleased that this beauty exists again. International tourists come for different reasons. Many know the room primarily as a mystery, having read articles or seen documentaries about the lost amber room. They come expecting to see a reconstruction of something famous for being lost, and they're often surprised by how affecting the actual experience of being in the room is. They anticipated an interesting museum exhibit, and instead find themselves moved by beauty they didn't expect to find so overwhelming. Art historians and specialists in Baroque design come to study the craftsmanship, to examine how closely the recreation matches historical photographs, to understand the techniques used in both the original creation and the modern reconstruction. They move through the room differently than casual visitors, slower, more analytical, examining joins between panels, studying how the amber pieces fit together, appreciating details that most viewers don't notice. Some visitors come bearing grief, carrying their own losses that the amber room somehow represents. People who've lost family heirlooms in wars or disasters, who've seen their own country's cultural treasures destroyed or stolen, who understand viscerally what it means to have beauty torn away by violence. For them, the recreated room offers a kind of hope, proof that what was lost can sometimes be rebuilt, that beauty destroyed can be beauty remade, that devastation doesn't have to be the final word. Children are brought by parents who want them to understand something about history, about art, about the persistence of human creativity. The children often struggle to stand still, wanting to move through the room quickly, not yet having the patience to absorb beauty slowly. But sometimes a child will stop, will notice how the light changes across amber surfaces, will ask questions about how it was made, will connect to the room in ways that might shape their appreciation of art for the rest of their lives. Photographers come, despite regulations limiting photography, trying to capture the glow, to record how light moves through amber. They discover what everyone who tries to photograph the amber room discovers, that cameras can't quite capture what being in the room feels like, that the experience resists reproduction, that you have to be there, standing in the golden light to fully understand why people call it the eighth wonder of the world. Each visitor, regardless of their reason for coming, leaves with their own private experience. Their own particular reaction to standing inside a room where walls glow with fossilized tree resin, harvested from ancient forests, where Baroque craftsmanship creates beauty so intense it almost hurts to look at directly. They leave carrying this experience with them, adding their own story to the room's ever-expanding collection of stories, becoming part of its history themselves. The room receives them all without judgment, glows for everyone equally, offers its beauty to whoever comes with the patience to receive it. This democratic generosity is perhaps the recreation's greatest achievement, that it exists not in a private collection, but in a public palace, accessible to anyone willing to make the journey, to wait in line, to spend a few quiet minutes inside captured light. Standing in the recreated amber room, it's easy to forget what the creation of such beauty actually costs, not in money, but in human terms. In the accumulated hours and efforts and sacrifices that transform raw materials into art that overwhelms the senses. The original amber room required approximately 6 tons of Baltic amber, gathered over years from beaches and amber mines across the Baltic region. Each piece had to be found, evaluated, purchased or harvested, transported. The amber itself represents millions of years, ancient resin hardening into fossilized form, compressed by geological time, shaped by forces beyond human comprehension, finally returning to human hands to be transformed into something impossible and beautiful. The craftspeople who created the original panels, Schluter, Wolfram, and the many unnamed artisans who worked under their direction, spent years of their lives on this single project. Years of cutting and polishing, of fitting pieces together, of backing amber with gold, of creating Baroque designs in a medium that resists haste and punishes mistakes. These were prime working years, hours that could have been spent on other projects, other commissions, other works that might have brought more immediate reward. The recreation carried similar costs. 24 years from project inception to completion, from 1979 when planning began to 2003 when the room opened. Those 24 years represent lifetimes. Craftspeople who started as young adults and became middle-aged during the project, who spent their peak productive years creating something they wouldn't fully own, something that would belong to the state, to the public, to history. The financial cost was substantial. Estimates suggest the recreation cost approximately $11 million. Though the actual figure is difficult to confirm given the project's extended timeline and the economic chaos of 1990s Russia. But beyond direct costs were opportunity costs. What else could have been done with that money? What other projects could have been funded? What other needs could have been addressed? This question of cost versus value appears whenever societies dedicate substantial resources to art, rather than immediate practical needs. Should $11 million have gone to recreating an amber room when people were struggling economically in post-Soviet Russia? Should years of skilled labour have gone to amber work when there were hospitals needing doctors, schools needing teachers, infrastructure needing repair? These are fair questions, and they don't have simple answers. Beauty has value, but that value is difficult to quantify in ways that compete with food, shelter, medical care, education. You can argue that the Amber Room creates value through tourism, through cultural prestige, through the employment it provides to guides and maintenance staff and the businesses that support visitors. But this still feels like justification after the fact. Trying to make beauty pay for itself in practical terms. Perhaps the real answer is that beauty doesn't need practical justification, that humans create art not because it's economically efficient, but because creating beauty is part of what makes us human. The Amber Room exists in both its original and recreated forms because people believed that a room glowing with amber light was worth creating, that the world was better for having such beauty in it, that the cost was justified by the result regardless of practical return. But this answer also acknowledges privilege. The people making decisions to fund the Amber Room's creation and recreation were not themselves struggling for survival. Frederick I could commission an amber room because he had resources beyond immediate needs. Catherine the Great could complete and expand it because Russian wealth allowed such expenditure. Soviet and Russian authorities could fund the recreation because they had budget surpluses, or could argue that cultural projects deserved funding even when other needs went unmet. The craftspeople had less choice. They worked on the Amber Room because that was their employment, their trade, their way of making a living. Some undoubtedly felt honoured to participate in creating something so significant. Others might have preferred more diverse commissions, might have grown weary of amber work over decades, might have resented the project's demands. We don't have extensive personal accounts from the artisans, so we can only speculate about their feelings. What we know is that creating the Amber Room both times required immense dedication from people who chose or were chosen to give substantial portions of their lives to making amber glow on walls. Their work created beauty that has moved millions of people, that has become famous worldwide, that will likely endure for centuries. Whether that was worth what it cost them personally, whether they felt the sacrifice was justified, whether they would make the same choice if offered again. These are questions only they could answer, and most are gone now, their thoughts on the subject lost with them. The cost of beauty is paid not just in money and materials, but in time that cannot be recovered, in opportunities not taken, in paths not followed because this path was chosen instead. The Amber Room exists because people were willing to pay these costs, and we benefit from their willingness every time we stand in that golden glow and feel something shift in our understanding of what humans can create when they dedicate themselves fully to making beauty manifest in the world. Let's return to amber itself, the substance at the heart of this story, the material that makes the room possible and gives it its unique character, its particular magic. Amber is not stone, though it's hard. It's not mineral, though it endures like minerals do. Amber is organic, formed from tree resin, created by living things and transformed by time into something that seems to exist between the living world and the geological world, belonging fully to neither. When a tree is wounded by storm damage, by insect boring, by disease, it produces resin to seal the wound, to protect itself from infection and further damage. This resin is sticky, thick, golden when first produced. It flows slowly down the tree's trunk or drips to the forest floor. And sometimes, in certain conditions, this resin doesn't simply dry and crumble as most resin does. Sometimes it's buried, covered by sediment, compressed by the weight of earth accumulating above it. Over millions of years, chemical changes occur. The organic compounds in the resin polymerize, forming long molecular chains that give amber its hardness and stability. Volatile compounds evaporate or break down. What remains is something transformed, no longer resin in any functional sense but not yet stone, existing in a category of its own. The Baltic amber used in the amber room is typically between 35 and 50 million years old, formed during the Eocene epoch when the region was covered by vast forests of conifers. These forests are long gone, destroyed by ice ages and geological upheaval, but their resin persists, washed up on beaches, mined from coastal deposits, waiting to be found and transformed by human hands into jewellery, ornaments, or in rare cases, rooms that glow with captured light. Inside amber, you sometimes find extraordinary things, perfectly preserved insects, their delicate wing structures intact, caught in mid-flight 40 million years ago. Tiny spiders frozen in their last moment of movement, fragments of leaves from trees that no longer exist, bubbles of ancient air, atmospheric samples from an era when the planet was warmer, when the continents were arranged differently, when no humans existed to witness the forests that would eventually become the amber itself. This quality of preservation, this capacity to trap and hold moments from unimaginable time depths, gives amber a particular character. It's literally memory made solid, time made tangible. When you hold a piece of amber containing an insect, you're holding something that hasn't changed in 40 million years, that looks exactly as it did when the resin first flowed around it in a forest that existed before recognizable mammals, before grasslands, before most of the world we know took its current form. The amber room, then, is built from memory, from preserved time, from moments captured millions of years before humans existed and transformed into beauty by humans who would be gone long before the amber itself degraded. There's something profound in that temporal layering, the ancient made beautiful by the relatively recent, the geological shaped by the historical deep time transformed into human art. Amber also has this quality of warmth that other precious materials lack. Gold is cold to the touch. Diamonds feel neutral. But amber, because of its organic origin and its particular thermal properties, feels slightly warm, seems to hold heat even when it's been sitting in cool air. This warmth is subtle but perceptible, and it adds to the room's particular character. The walls don't just look warm with their golden glow, they actually feel warmer than walls made of stone or metal or wood would feel. The colour variations in amber, from pale yellow that's almost clear to deep orange that's nearly opaque, from honey gold to reddish brown, come from different levels of oxidation and different amounts of trapped organic material and air bubbles. No two pieces are identical. Each carries its own particular shade, its own pattern of inclusions and clarities. Building something from amber means accepting this variation, working with the material's natural diversity rather than trying to force uniformity. This is what the craftspeople who created both the original and the recreated amber room had to understand and accept, that they were working with a material that had its own character, its own will in some sense, that couldn't be forced into shapes it didn't want to take. The room exists as a collaboration between human intention and amber's natural properties, between Baroque design principles and the limitations and possibilities inherent in fossilized tree resin. Standing in the room, you're surrounded by millions of years of geological time, by forests that disappeared into deep history, by resin that flowed before human ancestors walked upright. The room connects human art to natural processes operating on timescales we can barely comprehend, linking our brief creative efforts to forces and spans of time that dwarf our individual lives and even our species' existence. Amber remembers in its way, remembers the forests, remembers the wounds that produced the resin, remembers the creatures caught in its slow flow. The amber room uses that memory to create beauty, to transform deep time into immediate experience, to let visitors stand inside something that connects present consciousness to the distant past in ways that intellectual knowledge alone could never achieve. The Amber Room story is ultimately about impermanence and persistence, about what survives and what doesn't, about the relationship between beauty and time. The original room existed for approximately 228 years, from its creation around 1715 to its disappearance in 1943. 228 years is longer than most human creations last, longer than most buildings stand, longer than most nations persist in recognizable form. By any reasonable measure, the original Amber Room had a successful existence, was admired by thousands of people across multiple generations, fulfilled its purpose of creating beauty and inspiring wonder. But 228 years is nothing in geological time, is barely a moment in the life of the amber itself, which existed for tens of millions of years before being shaped into panels and will, if the fragments survive, exist for millions more after whatever ultimate fate befell it. The room's existence was an interlude in the amber's longer story, a brief period when ancient resin was shaped into human art before potentially returning to obscurity or destruction. This perspective can feel either comforting or melancholic, depending on your temperament. Comforting, because it reminds us that even treasures we mourn weren't meant to last forever, that impermanence is built into existence, that loss is inevitable and therefore in some sense acceptable. Melancholic because it emphasizes how brief beautiful things can be, how quickly they can disappear, how little our efforts to preserve and protect can matter when forces larger than preservation come into play. What does endure, regardless of whether the original panels survive, is the idea of the Amber Room, the story, the inspiration it provides. Millions of people who will never see even the recreation know about the Amber Room, know its story, carry some image of it in their minds. It exists in books and documentaries, in paintings and descriptions, in the collective cultural memory of multiple nations. In this form, as story, as symbol, as inspiration, the Amber Room is essentially indestructible, will continue existing as long as humans tell stories about beauty lost and sought. The recreation adds another layer to this endurance. It's not the original, will never be the original, but it fulfills many of the original's functions. It creates that experience of standing inside glowing amber walls. It demonstrates Baroque craftsmanship. It inspires awe and wonder. In these ways, it carries forward the original's purpose, ensuring that the Amber Room continues to exist not just as story, but as experienced reality, as something you can actually visit and walk through and be changed by. But what about the knowledge, the techniques, the craft that went into creating the room? Here the story becomes more uncertain. The original craftspeople carried knowledge that was partially lost when they died. Knowledge that the recreationists had to rediscover through experimentation and inference. Each generation of amber workers adds to the collective understanding, but also loses things that aren't written down, aren't transmitted, aren't considered important enough to preserve until it's too late and the knowledge is gone. This pattern of partial loss and partial preservation, of some things enduring while others fade, is characteristic of all human endeavours. We save what we think is important, what we have resources to preserve, what happens to survive by accident or by being in the right place at the right time. We lose what seems unimportant until we need it, what's too expensive to maintain, what's simply unlucky in its timing or location. The Amber Room reminds us that even spectacular beauty, even carefully preserved treasures, even things valued by entire nations are not exempt from this pattern. Creation doesn't guarantee preservation. Value doesn't ensure survival. Care and attention can extend existence but can't make anything truly permanent. Yet this very impermanence might be part of what makes beauty valuable. If the amber room were indestructible, if we knew it would exist forever regardless of what we did or didn't do, would it matter as much? Part of our appreciation comes from understanding that beauty is fragile, that it requires active care to survive, that its loss is always possible, and therefore its presence is something to be grateful for rather than taken for granted. The recreation will fade eventually too. The amber will darken with age, will become brittle, will require maintenance and eventually replacement. In a few centuries, the panels being admired today will themselves be historical artifacts requiring care or recreation. The cycle continues: creation, aging, decay, recreation, aging again, beauty persisting through continuous renewal rather than through permanent, unchanging existence. This is perhaps the deepest lesson the Amber Room teaches, that beauty endures not by being indestructible, but by being valued enough to be recreated, by being important enough that people dedicate resources to its preservation, by mattering enough that its loss is grieved and, when possible, repaired. What endures is not the specific amber molecules, but the idea that rooms should glow with golden light, that craftsmanship can create overwhelming beauty, that time and effort spent in service of aesthetic achievement is time and effort well spent. What endures is the commitment to beauty itself, to the value of creating things that serve no practical purpose except to be magnificent, to remind us that human capability extends beyond survival into the realm of making the world more beautiful than it needs to be. The original panels, wherever they are, destroyed in fire or hidden in darkness, have become less important than the Amber Room as concept, as inspiration, as symbol of what humans can create when we set out to make something purely beautiful. Something that exists for no reason except to be admired, to create wonder, to demonstrate what's possible when skill and patience and dedication align in service of an aesthetic vision. In the end, perhaps the Amber Room's greatest achievement is illuminating something about the relationship between light and darkness, between presence and absence, between what we can see and what remains hidden. The room itself in both iterations exists as captured light, as a space designed specifically to glow, to transform daylight or candlelight into something warm and golden and enveloping. Walking into the Amber Room is walking into light made tangible, into brightness that has weight and presence, into illumination that feels substantial rather than ethereal. But the room's story is equally defined by darkness, the darkness of its disappearance, the darkness of sealed tunnels and salt mines where it might be hidden, the darkness of uncertainty about its fate, the darkness of war and occupation and destruction that ended its 2-century reign of peaceful beauty. These elements exist in tension, in dialogue with each other. The light the room creates is meaningful partly because we know how easily that light can be extinguished, how quickly it can disappear. The beauty becomes more precious because its vulnerability is proven, because we've witnessed what happens when beauty encounters violence, when aesthetic achievement meets systematic destruction. The searchers who spent decades looking for the original room were, in a sense, looking for light in darkness, convinced that somewhere in the chaos and destruction of the mid-20th century Europe, the golden panels were waiting to be brought back into visibility. Their searches took them into literal darkness, into mines and bunkers and sealed chambers, into places where light didn't reach, where the absence of the Amber Room felt almost tangible, where not finding it created a void that seemed to expand with each unsuccessful excavation. This pattern of searching in darkness for something that represents light, of believing that somewhere beyond our current vision there might be beauty waiting to be discovered, extends beyond the specific case of the Amber Room. It's fundamentally human. This conviction that what is lost might be found, that what has disappeared into obscurity might be brought back into illumination, that darkness is temporary and light, in some form, will return. The recreation represents a different approach to the same impulse. Rather than searching for lost light, it creates new light. Rather than trying to recover the original glow, it builds a different glow from scratch. This is an act of defiance against darkness. A refusal to accept that because the original is gone, all light must be gone. It says, if we cannot find the light that was lost, we will make new light. If we cannot recover what was taken, we will create something that fulfills the same purpose, that brings golden glow back into the world, even if it's not the same amber glowing. Standing in the recreated room, you experience light that wasn't there a few decades ago, that exists because people decided absence was unacceptable, that the Catherine Palace should glow again with amber even if it couldn't be the original amber creating that glow. The room is an argument, made in amber and gold, that beauty can return even after catastrophic loss, that light can be brought back into spaces where darkness had settled, that human creativity can respond to destruction, not just with mourning, but with recreation, with the active choice to make the world beautiful again. The mystery of what happened to the original panels, the question of whether they burned or remain hidden, becomes in this light almost secondary to the larger truth the room illustrates. Beauty exists in time, is subject to all of time's hazards, can be lost in moments regardless of how carefully we try to protect it. But beauty can also return, can be recreated, can glow again if enough people decide that its return matters, that the world should have amber rooms even when amber rooms disappear. The darkness, then, the darkness of the war that destroyed or hid the original, the darkness of the searches that found nothing. The darkness of not knowing what actually happened is real and permanent. We cannot illuminate what happened in Königsberg Castle in April of 1945. We cannot shine light into those last moments of the original room's existence and see definitively whether it burned or was evacuated. That darkness is historical, factual, unchangeable. But we can create new light in response to that darkness. We can build rooms that glow. We can train craftspeople in amber work. We can preserve the techniques and aesthetics that create beauty like the amber room created beauty. We can ensure that the loss, however real, is not the final word. That darkness does not simply remain when light disappears, but is challenged by human determination to bring illumination back into the world. The amber room, in its current form, glows not despite its history of loss, but somehow because of it. Because that loss made clear how much such beauty matters, how worth recreating it is, how important it is to refuse to let darkness be permanent when we have the capability to respond with light. And perhaps this is what any of us can learn from the amber room's long, strange journey, that loss is real, but response to loss is possible, that what disappears can sometimes be brought back in different form, that the appropriate response to darkness is not to accept it as inevitable, but to light candles, to build glowing rooms, to insist that beauty belongs in the world, and that we, collectively, have both the responsibility and the capability to keep bringing it back, again and again. For as long as we exist to appreciate what light and gold and patient craftsmanship can create together, we've travelled a long way together tonight, through 3 centuries and across continents, from the shores of the Baltic where amber has washed up for millions of years to the palaces of Prussia and Russia, through the darkness of war and the light of recreation, through mystery and loss and the strange redemption that comes from making beauty again, even when the original beauty is gone. From those first amber craftsmen in early 18th century Prussia, carefully cutting and fitting pieces of fossilized resin into Baroque designs, to the Catherine Palace where the room glowed for 2 centuries in peaceful magnificence, to Königsberg where it disappeared into the chaos of 1945, to the searches that followed and found nothing, to the patient hands that recreated it panel by panel across 24 years, we've traced a story that's about more than a room made of amber. It's about what we value, what we're willing to fight to preserve, what we mourn when it's lost, and what we're capable of rebuilding when we decide that absence is not acceptable. The question I posed at the beginning, implicitly if not explicitly, was what happened to the original amber room? The answer, as honestly as I can give it after everything we've explored together, is that we don't know for certain. The most likely scenario is that it burned in Königsberg Castle in April of 1945, destroyed so completely that nothing recognizable remained. But proof of that destruction doesn't exist, and in that absence of proof lives the continued possibility, however slim, that somewhere the golden panels wait to be found, that the mystery might yet be solved. But perhaps the more important answer is that the amber room, in the ways that truly matter, endures. It glows again in the Catherine Palace, recreated by craftspeople who understood that some beauty is worth the effort of reconstruction. It lives in memory, in stories, in the inspiration it provides to anyone who hears about rooms made of amber that glow like captured sunlight. And it exists as a reminder that beauty is both fragile and resilient, vulnerable to destruction, yet capable of return if enough people care to bring it back. If you enjoyed this slow drift through history and mystery, a like and subscribe truly helps others find these calm explorations of the past. And to those who have already subscribed, who return to these long journeys through time, thank you for being here, for spending these hours with me in contemplation of beauty lost and found. Wherever you are in the world right now, in a quiet room where night has settled, in a space you've made peaceful for a few hours, in whatever corner you've claimed as yours for rest, I hope this story has given you something worth carrying forward. I hope your breathing has slowed over these 2.5 hours. I hope your thoughts have quieted into something more peaceful. I hope your body feels heavy and ready for sleep, muscles relaxed, mind settled, the day's tensions released into darkness where they can't trouble you anymore. Look up, if you can, and imagine amber, not the jewellery or the small pieces we see in museums, but the vast deposits still buried in the earth along the Baltic coast, millions of tons of fossilized resin waiting to be found, or remaining buried forever, carrying their ancient memories in darkness. Imagine forests that grew 40 million years ago, conifers reaching toward a sun that shone on a world without humans, their resin flowing over bark in response to damage we'll never know the cause of. Imagine that resin hardening, being buried, compressed, transformed over geological time into something that would eventually glow on palace walls, that would inspire wonder, that would be lost and grieved and recreated by people who understood that beauty matters enough to dedicate years to its return. All that time, all those transformations, all those human hands shaping ancient materials into something that makes light warm and tangible, and present in a way that nothing else quite achieves. The amber room represents this: time made visible, effort made manifest, beauty made real through patient dedication to craft and aesthetic vision. Whether the original panels exist or not, this truth endures, that humans can create overwhelming beauty from materials the earth has spent millions of years preparing, that we can build rooms that glow with golden light, that we can look at something and decide it must exist in the world regardless of cost or difficulty or time required. Sleep well then. Dream, if you dream, of golden rooms where light lives in walls, of craftspeople fitting tiny pieces of amber into patterns that will glow for centuries, of forests ancient beyond imagining creating resin that waits in earth until someone finds it and understands its possibilities. Dream of beauty that endures through time and disaster, through loss and recreation, through all the hazards of existence in a world that preserves nothing forever, but allows some things to be brought back again and again by people who refuse to let the darkness have the final word. Good night. May you rest peacefully in whatever darkness surrounds you now, knowing that somewhere, in a palace outside St. Petersburg, amber walls glow warmly for anyone who makes the journey to see them, that beauty exists in the world because people decided it should exist, that the amber room, in whatever form, original or recreated, continues its work of making light tangible and wonder possible for anyone willing to stand still long enough to receive it.